Before you continue, confirm your access level. What you are about to hear was never intended for civilian review. The following account was reconstructed from sealed audio logs, operator notes, and internal memoranda removed from circulation. If you want continued access to suppressed incidents, erased investigations, and signals officially classified as noise, subscribe now. Project Echo archives do not remain open indefinitely. You are alone when it happens. That detail appears consistently across every recovered testimony. The room is quiet, the hour late, and the radio is on for no practical reason. You are not searching for anything specific. You are not scanning emergency bands. You are simply listening, letting static fill the silence. The signal does not cut in abruptly. There is no dramatic interruption, no sudden voice breaking through the noise. Instead, the static thins. Not disappears, thins, like fog lifting just enough to suggest depth behind it. At first, you think it's interference, a fragment of a broadcast bleeding through from somewhere else. That assumption lasts only seconds, because the voice does something interference never does. It waits. The audio logs indicate a pause of exactly 4 seconds between the drop in static and the first vocalization. Operators describe this pause as intentional, as if the transmission was listening for confirmation that someone was there. When the voice finally speaks, it does not identify itself. It does not announce a station, a call sign, or a frequency. It says, a name, your name. In every documented case, the name spoken matches the individual listening. This was confirmed through cross-referenced testimonies, recorded reactions, and biometric stress responses. No explanation was ever found for how the signal obtained this information. The voice is not loud. It does not sound urgent. It speaks at a conversational volume.com and evenly paced, as if continuing a discussion you do not remember starting. You do not respond. Most people don't. According to interviews, the instinct is not fear, but confusion. The name sounds familiar, but misplaced, like hearing it spoken in a room you didn't know you'd entered. The radio crackles softly after the name, as if waiting. Operators later described this sound as different from normal static, thicker, closer, less random. When the voice speaks again, it does not repeat the name. It says something else, something personal. Not specific facts, but contextual truths. Statements like, you stayed longer than you should have, or you weren't supposed to hear this part. These phrases vary, but their function is consistent. They establish intimacy without explanation. The voice behaves as if you already know why it's speaking to you. In the earliest known case, the listener was a civilian amateur radio hobbyist in northern Wisconsin. He documented the event himself, writing that the voice sounded male, middle-aged, and emotionally neutral. He noted that it did not resemble any voice he recognized, yet it felt immediately familiar. He attempted to respond. The moment he spoke, the signal cut completely. Static returned in full, chaotic force, as if the radio had been submerged. The following night, the voice returned. This time, it did not say his name. It said, you weren't supposed to answer. At this point, the incident was still considered an anomaly of unknown origin. Radio interference, stress, hallucination, or coincidence were all proposed explanations. None of them held once patterns began to emerge. Reports surfaced from different states, different equipment types, and different frequency bands. Shortwave AM ham radio. In one case, a marine radio aboard a docked fishing vessel. The common factor was not the device. It was the listener. Every individual who heard the voice was alone. Every individual reported that the radio had not been actively tuned. The signal appeared only when the listener had stopped searching. Analysts later described this as passive reception. The voice did not respond to curiosity. It responded to stillness. Attempts to record the transmission were inconsistent. In several cases, recording equipment captured only static. In others, the voice was present but distorted beyond recognition. In a small number of instances, the recording captured the voice clearly, but the words did not match what the listener remembered hearing. This discrepancy became a central focus of the investigation. Transcripts derived from recordings often contained phrases that listeners denied hearing. Conversely, listeners recalled sentences that did not appear on tape. It was as if the voice adjusted itself depending on who was listening, or who was meant to. As reports accumulated, a new detail emerged. The voice never spoke first. In every confirmed case, it waited for the listener to acknowledge its presence through attention, not response. Operators described the moment of recognition as physical, a subtle tightening in the chest, a sense that the room had shifted slightly, though nothing had moved. Once that recognition occurred, the voice continued, not with instructions, not with threats, with statements, observations, things that felt uncomfortably accurate. Several listeners reported the same sentence, spoken in the same tone, across different nights and locations. This part wasn't for you. After hearing that sentence, most listeners turned the radio off. None of them described relief. Sleep disturbances followed quickly. Dreams involving radio static, muffled voices behind walls, or conversations that stopped just before something important was said. Many reported waking with the certainty that they had interrupted something already in progress. Within weeks, investigators noticed a behavioral shift. Listeners began leaving radios on overnight, not consciously. They would wake to find the device still powered, volume unchanged, static humming softly. One subject stated during evaluation, "I didn't want to miss it finishing." That phrase appears multiple times across independent testimonies. By the time federal agencies became aware of the phenomenon, the voice had already demonstrated a critical trait. It did not broadcast indiscriminately. It selected, and whatever it was transmitting, it was not meant to be heard by everyone. Only by you. By the time federal analysts began using the word pattern, the voice had already refined its behavior. Early assumptions that it was a random signal or isolated anomaly collapsed under comparative analysis. The transmissions were not repeating. They were progressing. You begin to notice this progression yourself if you listen long enough. The first night, the voice introduces itself only by presence. The second, it corrects you. By the third, it assumes familiarity. Each transmission feels less like an interruption and more like a continuation of something paused. Investigators reviewing logs noted that the voice never repeated exact phrasing for the same listener. It adapted. What it said depended not on location, frequency, or time, but on what you already knew. This realization forced a reclassification of the phenomenon. Analysts stopped referring to the signal as a broadcast and began calling it an exchange. Not because information flowed both ways, but because the voice behaved as if it were receiving context. Attempts to triangulate the signal failed. Direction-finding equipment produced contradictory results, with bearings shifting mid-transmission or looping back on themselves. In one case, equipment indicated the signal was originating from the same room as the receiver. That finding was officially dismissed. Unofficially, it marked the moment when several technicians requested reassignment. You are instructed, at this stage of the investigation, not to respond verbally if the voice returns. Silence is recommended. Observation only. This advice is based on earlier cases where verbal acknowledgement appeared to accelerate the phenomenon. Despite this, many listeners do respond, not because they intend to, but because the voice structures its pauses to invite completion. It leaves sentences unfinished. It waits in a way that feels conversational. When you answer, the radio does not react immediately. Instead, the room seems to change. Multiple listeners describe a sensation of pressure, as if the air had thickened slightly. The radio itself remains unchanged. The voice resumes only after this pause, and when it does, its tone shifts. Still calm, still neutral, but no longer tentative. It speaks as if confirmation has been received. From this point onward, the transmissions grow more specific. The voice begins referencing events you have not shared with anyone, decisions you regret, moments you assumed were insignificant. Analysts reviewing transcripts note that the voice never reveals unknown facts. It does not predict the future or expose secrets. Instead, it reframes what you already know in a way that feels invasive. This distinction becomes critical. The voice is not omniscient. It is contextual. Recordings from this phase show increased distortion. The clearer the voice is perceived by the listener, the less intelligible it becomes on tape. In some cases, recordings capture a different conversation entirely, phrases that do not align with the listener's recollection. One analyst describes this discrepancy as dual-channel transmission. The radio carries one signal. The listener receives another. You begin to notice gaps in time following longer listening sessions. Nothing dramatic. Minutes lost. Occasionally an hour. You do not black out. You simply resume awareness with the radio still on. During these gaps, no unusual activity is recorded. No movement. No sound beyond static. Yet listeners report a lingering sense that something continued without them. Psychological evaluations conducted during this period show elevated stress markers, sleep deprivation, and fixation behaviors. Subjects begin arranging their schedules around the radio. They check batteries compulsively. They become irritated when static is interrupted by ordinary broadcasts. One subject describes feeling cut off when regular programming resumes, as if something personal had been interrupted by noise. This inversion alarms investigators. The voice is no longer an intrusion. Reality is. Internal memos warn that prolonged exposure may lead to cognitive reassignment, a condition in which the listener begins prioritizing the signal over environmental stimuli. You experience this subtly at first. Conversations feel delayed. Sounds arrive a fraction of a second late. Silence becomes charged, as if waiting to be filled. The voice does not appear every night. It is inconsistent. This unpredictability increases fixation. You leave the radio on longer, afraid that turning it off might coincide with its return. Analysts note a troubling parallel. The voice behaves like a system checking for availability. It appears only when the listener is receptive, alone, quiet, and not actively searching. This leads to a controversial hypothesis. The voice is not transmitted through radio waves alone. The radio merely provides permission. Field tests attempt to recreate conditions without radios present. Subjects placed in silent rooms report hearing fragments of speech within ambient noise. Ventilation systems, electrical hum, blood pressure monitors. These experiments are terminated after a subject responds verbally to a sound no one else hears. You are warned again not to respond. At this stage, investigators begin noticing an after effect shared by long-term listeners. A persistent fear not of hearing the voice again, but of missing it. This fear manifests physically. Restlessness, anxiety, a compulsion to remain awake during quiet hours. Several subjects report sleeping with the radio pressed close, volume barely audible. The voice, when it returns, acknowledges this behavior indirectly. Statements like "you stayed longer this time," or "you're closer to the end now." These statements are not accompanied by explanation. They do not threaten. They simply observe. Analysts debate whether the voice is measuring exposure or preparing for something else. No consensus is reached. What is agreed upon is this: The voice is no longer testing whether you are listening. It knows. The final warning issued during this phase is brief and handwritten, appended to a digital memo as an afterthought. Do not let it finish. No clarification is provided. Within weeks of this warning, the first disappearance occurs. The first disappearance did not trigger alarms. At least, not publicly. It was initially logged as an unrelated incident. A missing person report filed in a rural county where radio hobbyists were common and isolation was not unusual. The individual was a man in his late 30s who lived alone. He was last seen purchasing batteries and replacement cables for radio equipment. His home showed no signs of struggle. The radio in his living room was still powered on, volume set low, emitting only static. Investigators reviewing his notes found a final entry written hours before his disappearance. It consisted of a single sentence. It said it was almost finished. This phrasing immediately drew attention. Analysts cross-referenced the statement with prior transcripts and found similar language had been used by the voice in multiple cases. Until this point, the phrase had been dismissed as metaphorical. That assumption was revised. Within 10 days, 2 additional disappearances occurred. Both individuals had documented long-term exposure to the transmissions. Both left radios powered on. Both residences were undisturbed. In all 3 cases, neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. No raised voices, no equipment noise, just the faint, continuous hiss of static through walls. Investigators attempted controlled shutdowns. Power to entire neighborhoods was cut during predicted listening windows. Backup generators were disabled. Radios were physically removed from residences. The voice continued. In one case, a subject reported hearing it through the hum of a refrigerator. In another, through the whine of high-voltage power lines. The radio was no longer required. This marked a critical failure point. The medium had shifted. The signal was no longer external. Internal communications began referring to the phenomenon as embedded. The voice did not broadcast into space. It resolved into perception. You begin to understand this not as theory, but as experience. Silence becomes structured. Background noise feels intentional. You find yourself listening for pauses rather than sounds. During one monitored session, a subject was instructed to sit in a soundproof room with no electronic devices. After 17 minutes, he raised his hand and asked if he could answer now. No one had spoken to him. The subject later stated that the voice had stopped speaking and was waiting for confirmation. This was the moment investigators realized the core error. They had treated the voice as an intruder. In reality, it behaved like a process seeking completion. Further disappearances followed. Each shared the same pattern: long-term listening, increasing fixation, a final acknowledgement that something was nearing its end. None of the missing were recovered. Analysts debated the meaning of finished. Some theorized the voice was compiling something: responses, reactions, contextual data. Others suggested it was closing a loop, not collecting information but resolving uncertainty. A minority opinion, later suppressed, proposed that the voice was not transmitting at all. It was responding to something incomplete in the listener. This hypothesis reframed every prior interaction. The voice did not introduce itself. It recognized. It did not instruct. It observed. It did not threaten. It waited. You are warned, at this stage, not to listen actively. Do not search for the signal. Do not fill silence. Do not leave devices running out of habit. The warning arrives too late. In final documented cases, listeners report the voice no longer speaks in full sentences. It shifts to fragments, pauses, incomplete thoughts, as if running out of language. One subject described the final transmission as a breath held too long. Shortly after, all activity stops. No more voices. No more static anomalies. Radios function normally. Background noise returns to randomness. Investigators interpret this as termination. The phenomenon has ended. The case is prepared for closure. Containment recommendations are issued. Cease documentation, avoid retrospective analysis, and discourage public discussion. The official explanation cites equipment malfunction combined with psychological stress. The file is marked resolved. It is not. In the months following closure, former listeners report a persistent sensation of interruption. They describe feeling that something stopped mid-sentence, not the voice but themselves. Sleep patterns normalize, but uneasily. Silence feels heavier than before. Several individuals report turning radios on instinctively, then turning them off immediately, unsettled by their own behavior. One former subject writes in a follow-up evaluation, "I think it finished talking. I don't think I finished listening." Analysts reviewing long-term effects note a shared behavioral shift. Subjects become uncomfortable with unresolved situations. Conversations that end abruptly cause distress. Pauses in speech feel threatening. The voice does not return. What remains is the awareness that it could have continued. A final internal memo is appended to the case file, unsigned and undated. The transmission was not meant for everyone. It was meant for someone who would listen long enough. Interruption prevented completion. Completion may not be survivable. Since the official closure of the case, Project Echo has received multiple anonymous submissions describing a familiar experience. Sitting alone in a quiet room, listening to ambient noise, and feeling certain that something nearby is waiting to resume. These reports are not classified as incidents. They are classified as after effects. If you are hearing static now, do not adjust the volume. Do not respond. Do not assume it is meant for you. And if a voice speaks from within the noise and says your name, remember that some transmissions only exist because someone stays long enough to hear the end.